Tower in Cleveland. And it's a tribute to his vision that the government be involved in housing and provide relief to those people who can't afford decent housing. It's still a struggle we have here in Cleveland. And today we're going to hear from participants from throughout the state of Ohio on how they're meeting those needs. And so without further ado, I'll turn it over. I do want to mention one other thing. Each year we have a VISTA, Volunteer in Service to America, which is the equivalent of the National Peace Corps. And Nasha is our VISTA this year, and she is doing a full year of service in poverty. And she had a real job, and now she has VISTA. So she is discovering what it's like to live when you struggle with money. And I think a lot of the clients that we work with struggle with money. And over in Shaker Square, we have seen many apartments that have collapsed, and people have been trying to find decent, safe, affordable housing, and they can't seem to find it, and struggling with water and heat, et cetera, in apartment buildings. So anyhow, that being said, we'll turn it over to Dr. Keating, who served emeritus faculty at Cleveland State University. He was the associate dean there for a number of years. So turn it over to Dennis and the panel and get going. Just a quick reminder, if you have questions, just post them in the chat and we'll get them there. And we look forward to your full participation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Charles or Chip, and good morning or good afternoon now. My name is Dennis Keating. I'm not Kay Martin, and I will be moderating the forum today. As Chip said, this forum has a long history of dealing with housing issues, including affordable housing. And today we are going to look at the overall situation in Ohio, and then we're going to look at 3 cities, Cincinnati, Cleveland, and Columbus, what their affordable housing needs are, both the city and perhaps the metropolitan area as well, and what those cities are doing, regardless of what the state of Ohio or the federal government is or is not doing. We have a great 4-person panel. I'm going to introduce them now, and then if you could hold your questions or comments until they finish speaking. Each of them is going to talk for about up to 15 minutes. You can also, as Chip already mentioned, put your questions or comments in chat, and we'll revisit those after our panel finishes speaking. So our first speaker from the Ohio Coalition of Homelessness and Housing, it's Director Amy Riegel. I've asked Amy to give us the overall situation as her organization sees it in Ohio, including recent issues that have come up in Columbus and the state legislature and with the governor. And then we're going to follow in alphabetical order of the 3 cities. First, Cincinnati with Kristen Baker, who's with Local Initiative Support Corporation for Greater Cincinnati, so the city and the metropolitan area. She's going to be followed by Michaela Wackers, who's the Assistant Director of Cleveland's Housing and Community Development Department. And then Carly Booz from Columbus. And Carly is with the Director of the Affordable Housing Alliance of Central Ohio. Again, both the city of Columbus, but also within the general metropolitan area. And I've asked each of the speakers if they would give us, for their cities, a sense of what the affordable housing needs are, what programs the city already has or has had in existence, and then in each of the cities, what, to their knowledge, the city and the city government is hoping or planning to do in the future to try to address those with or without needed aid from our state government or the federal government. So without further ado, I'm not going to read all their bios. They've been on the website. So in the interest of time, I'm going to go to Amy Riegel. And Amy, please get us started.
Yes, thank you very much. And I am going to try here to share my screen. Maybe. Okay. And share a little bit of information with you today about the state of housing here in Ohio overall. And so, as many of you know or can feel, the housing in Ohio is feeling a lot of pressure. And there's a lot of articles that have been coming out about how right now in the United States, it's the first time in over 20 years where the majority of people are cost burdened by their housing. And we are seeing that as a true indicator here in Ohio of just how imbalanced right now our wages are with the cost of housing. And so a little bit of data for those of you out there. Every year there's a survey done by the National Low Income Housing Coalition about how much a person has to earn in order to afford a modest 2-bedroom apartment in any given state, and then breaking that down across all of the MSAs in each of the states. And in Ohio, a person has to earn $17.05. Now, this data came out in June of 2022. So this data is already very outdated, and we know that that number has gone up. And as we look at communities across the state, you'll see the 3 C's there and a few other communities where the numbers are a little bit higher than the state average. You can see that in some areas, it could be up to $20 an hour that a person has to earn. So that means for an individual who's earning minimum wage, that they would have to work more than 1 full-time job, in some cases close to 2 full-time jobs, in order to be able to afford rent. And as we think about the fact that we might hear a lot in the news currently about this company's now paying $15 an hour, this company's giving signing bonuses, this company's doing this or that or whatever it is, we're happy to see those wages go up and to see a higher and higher average wage across many, especially service jobs within the state of Ohio. But even at that rate of increase in wages, it is not coming close to keeping up with the rent rises that we see. And so across the state of Ohio, in just 1 year, most areas saw a double-digit increase in rent. And even as we saw other markets towards the end of 2022 start to cool, and we saw those numbers go down a little bit more, rent was not one of the numbers that we saw a drastic decline in. Rent is still increasing at a rapid rate, and we're seeing that over and over and over again in the pressure that people are feeling as they go out and look for a job. And so if you are looking at for a job in the state of Ohio, we have many great jobs. We have great jobs coming to the state of Ohio. The state has done a great job at economic development attraction. But if we look at the top populated jobs in the state of Ohio, so these are the ones that people are the most likely to hold, what do those positions pay? What we see is that of the top 10 in the state of Ohio, only 2 of them comfortably pay more than the $17.05 that's needed to afford a 2-bedroom apartment. So even though we have jobs, and many employers will talk about how they're really dying for employees, and right now it's an employees market, and people, if you want a job, you can find a job, so on and so forth. Even though those jobs might be out there, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're able to provide for yourself and to be able to provide those basic needs and necessities within your life by working many of the jobs across the state. And so as you see, even some of those, such as a home health aide, a very short supply position right now across the state, it just doesn't pay enough to be able to afford housing in most communities across the state. And when we think about why this is, why we have rent rising so fast, part of it is that we just don't have enough supply. Currently in the state of Ohio, we have a shortage of 250,000 units of housing, 254,000 units of housing, just for extremely low income renters. And so these are renters who are earning 30% or below the area median income. Just within that population, we're short 250,000 units across the state. And of that same population of renters, 67% of them are severe cost burden in their units, meaning that they're paying more than 50% of their income on rent. And so we know that when a person is paying more than 50% of their income on rent, that it makes their choices in other areas very difficult. Everything from being able to purchase food or, being able to buy the school supplies for your kids, or being able to provide those things that we need every day in our households, like toilet paper and laundry detergent and things that are basic necessities for each and every day. There is a shortage of housing in different pockets of the state. Many will talk about the housing shortage for individuals who are looking to buy a home. If you go on Zillow right now and even look in your own neighborhood for a 3-bedroom house that's 1,500 square feet, you might not find a lot of them, especially if you're looking for a single story home with no steps up to the entry, kind of that house that many would want to age in place in. Those are really hard to find across the state. But if you are an individual who is living at a moderate income, or who may be in a higher level of income, there are more options available to you. The higher your income is, the more you can look around and you have more and more choices that you can select from. I always give the example, if Jeff Bezos wants to buy a house, he can buy any house he wants. He can, if he comes and says, I'll give you $1 million for your house, $100 million for your house, how many people are going to turn that down? Especially if it is far more than their house is worth. However, as you go down, you become more limited in your choices. And when we get to individuals who are at 30% or below area median income, that's where we see those choices really start to diminish and that market start to get really tight. And that is where we're starting to see the incredible use that the state has had of emergency rental assistance, especially the money that was received by the communities directly from the federal government during COVID, and then in the last 3 years. And then where we also are seeing is that emergency rental assistance is starting to wane, where we see evictions once again starting to rise. And in that, what we see is we're starting to feel the undercurrents of what that's doing for individuals who are experiencing homelessness. And so it's not necessarily that homelessness is the first stop after your first eviction or the first stop after even a series of evictions, but each of those factors of being severely cost burdened, of not being able to have enough money to provide for other daily needs within your life, to being behind in maybe your utility payments, and then also experiencing eviction. This is where we see people then entering the homeless system. And what we're seeing right now is that though the overall number of homeless individuals in 2022 didn't dramatically go up, what we did see is that there are more individuals with children, so families experiencing homelessness. We see more people who are experiencing homelessness in an unsheltered situation. And we see that the length of stay for individuals who are entering the homeless system is increasing. And so people who would normally maybe have exited homeless shelters within 7 to 21 days are now seeing extended stays of over 30 days within the homeless shelter in order to be rehoused. And then we're seeing many, many long stayers or individuals who are considered chronic within the homeless system. Now, where we see the decrease in homelessness is in areas like veterans. And part of that is because at the federal level and then at many local levels, the communities adopted a strategic plan around the housing of veterans, and multiple agencies came together to make these programs possible and to kind of seamlessly be able to take people through this process. And so with that coordinated effort that was uniformly rolled out from city to city across the country, we have been able to see improvements. So there is a roadmap of how we would be able to start to address the homeless issues that are currently rising across the country, if we are able to secure the right federal resources and have the right community support for those types of efforts to move forward. But as we start to think about more solutions and everything that's needed, the answer really is that we do need to invest in more affordable housing. So one, we need more supply. We need more housing units to be preserved and built within our communities so that that affordable housing is there. And then that there are the right subsidies in place so that for individuals who may be at zero income or have extremely low income, that they're able to use that housing as a stabilizing point, if possible, to help them increase their economic opportunity, or if they're in a situation where they would need long-term supports, that those long-term supports can be provided to those individuals. So we really need to invest in affordable housing. Unfortunately, at the end of 2022, within the state of Ohio, we had a proposal, COHIO, along with other organizations, were really advocating for the state to invest some of their ARPA or their American Recovery dollars, the state and local recovery funds, into affordable housing. They've invested into many things. Many of you in the cities that you represent might have a project that received funds through this pot of money. But one of the areas that they did not invest in was in affordable housing. And so there was a push for making that investment in affordable housing. Unfortunately, during the lame duck session, not only did we not get that investment in affordable housing, but there were also some steps backwards that we took within the housing space. So in House Bill 45 that was passed as like the last bill that came out of 2022, what we saw is three things. One, emergency rental assistance that's received by the state was appropriated, which was a step forward. But on that appropriation, they placed a clause that said that the money could only be spent on arrears from December 2021 or before. So we were in December 2022, and the rule was that it had to be from December 21 or before. And so it really made the money useless across the state. So right now we're sitting in a position where that money's been appropriated, but agencies are kind of, shaking their head because they're like, well, we can't use it. So there currently is a bill that has been passed by the Senate Bill 10, that would fix that and would remove the 2021 date, but there's still a lot of work there to do. It also reduced the twinning so that you can't twin state housing tax credits and low income housing, or I'm sorry, state historic tax credits and low income housing tax credits. There's also one that changed the valuation. There was of affordable housing properties. There was a big push to veto those line items, and the governor chose not to make that veto, but he has proposed some efforts in this new budget, kind of as a comprehensive housing plan. In lieu of those vetoes, this is what has been presented, which includes a state affordable housing tax credit, which would make a 4-year of infusion of dollars into our communities, a state single family housing tax credit, which would help have more home ownership opportunities for low and moderate income individuals, and then other things like money for communities to do zoning code updates, and also a program that would help landlords to report positive rent payments as a way of helping individuals build credit, which is a great opportunity to help some more individuals build credit and use that economic ladder to hopefully in the long term move into better rental housing or to move into home ownership. So there are some positive things in the governor's budget, but we are still waiting to see what will happen and how that will move through the State House over the next few months as we work through the budget. So I'll stop there and turn it over to the next
Well,
person.
thank you, Amy. That provides us with a good start and overview of the state. For those who have checked in now, as I mentioned earlier, we're going to hold the questions or comments until after our entire panel has spoken, and you can also enter those in the chat room. So our perspective is that while the affordable housing situation varies across the state, we wanted to focus on our three largest cities since more than likely the highest number of people facing affordable housing and related issues are in those cities of Cincinnati, Cleveland, and Columbus. And we're going to hear from three excellent speakers, taking the cities in alphabetical order. So we're going to start with the city of Cincinnati, and Kristen Baker, who's the executive director of the Local Initiative Support Corporation for Greater Cincinnati, is going to be our next speaker. Kristen, take it away.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me today. I'm Kristen Baker, Executive Director of LISC, Greater Cincinnati, and I'm going to step you through a little bit of what's happening here in Cincinnati around housing and housing affordability. So just a word about LISC, if you're not familiar, we are a national community development financial institution. We are now in 38 cities around the country, including Cleveland, recently opened office there last year. So we are here really to do two things: to provide financing to housing, particularly affordable housing and mixed use developments, and also to really support at a neighborhood level what community members want to see happening in their place, and how do we really marshal a resource to do that. So so this is just a little bit about sort of how we work as an investor capacity builder, convener, and really also focusing on innovation. So that leads to why I'm the ones talking to you about what's happening around housing in Cincinnati and Hamilton County. There, historically in our market, we didn't talk a lot about housing affordability. You know, I think there's this notion that we are a low cost of living community. Ohio in general, right? We have affordable housing because it's just cheaper to live here relative to bigger markets like New York or Chicago or Los Angeles, which is certainly true. But when we think about the work we do in the neighborhoods around Greater Cincinnati, particularly those in historically places that have been historically disinvested, we knew that neighbors were struggling to find housing, right? And Amy's prior set of data really highlights that at a state level. We knew that folks were not able to find housing that met their needs, both for their income or in the place where they wanted to be, or that was of quality. And at that time, our city government was not necessarily positioning themselves to take this on as an issue. We were really focused on repopulating, on bringing people back into the city center, on focusing on housing in downtown and some of our adjacent neighborhoods to downtown Cincinnati that really was more luxury market rate, condos, townhomes, you know, important to add vibrancy to our urban core, no doubt, but also we weren't necessarily using the tools in the toolkit to support affordable options for different income ranges in the community. So we started out on this journey by assessing the affordability situation here in Cincinnati and Hamilton County back in 2017, and found at that time that there were 40,000 households in the very lowest income quintile. So under 30% of area median income, roughly, you know, under $17,000 a year, that could not find housing that did not severely cost burden them. that they were not paying, many were paying, as you could imagine, at that income range, upwards of 60, 70, 80% of their monthly income towards housing costs, which is not sustainable, excuse me, or really a way for us to help households stabilize their income. So once we sort of identified that data, okay, what's next, right? We need to have a plan. We need to understand what the community should be doing to move towards creating more housing options for this region, both to build and sustain the growth that we're experiencing, but also to support folks that are here now with their housing needs. So typically, this is something a jurisdiction would undertake, right? And the city of Cincinnati was not interested in taking on planning around this at that time. And Hamilton County, a great partner around housing affordability as a secondary form of government, they also didn't feel that it was really in their purview to drive this. So LISC stepped in to say, all right, let's raise some resources. Let's select a planning team to really help us do this. And let's bring together experts in housing, people experiencing housing challenge themselves, folks that are providing support services to housing developers, both market rate and affordable developers, and those of us in the financing and funding community to say, what do we need to do to really try to tackle this issue? And that is Housing Our Future. So we launched this we finished this up in January of 2020, and we were ready to launch in March. And then some things happened that sort of caused us to pause. But we came back in the fall of 2020 to say, you know, here's the plan, right? While we're getting folks stabilized, resources, emergency assistance, especially rental assistance, was flowing at that point. We felt like it was a time that we could start to be a little more forward looking in terms of thinking about how does this align with where we need to go collectively as a community. And so this slide is a little grainy. I'm sorry if it doesn't look great on your screen, but this really highlights who all was in the mix and still is in our market around thinking about housing and demonstrating that we really have a comprehensive and inclusive approach to this work. So these figures are a little old and data we have assessed we're just compiling out of the 2020 census, sort of the next set of figures around this, which also I will just caution are not super accurate because they were collected prior to COVID, right? And like we are really living in a new world order where this data, it's helpful. It grounds us in sort of the pre-COVID times, but it's still not really necessarily real time telling us exactly what conditions are in the market. So we have to blend these things together. But again, I mentioned this 40,000 figure, and also we saw rents increasing, as Amy mentioned, and they continue to increase in our market. This chart's also a little dated, but it shows you sort of what we were seeing in 2019 around market prices and where we are and how much money folks are making and what they need to be able to afford. And we are pressed here, as I think we are across the state. We know that about a third of our households are still living in housing that is unaffordable to their current household budget. And that's really about the cost burden, right? And again, tying back to the statewide view, we know that the vast majority of our cost burden households are renters. And also they have incomes that really are hovering below $50,000, which lines up with a lot of the wage data that we know is out there in terms of how folks are making ends meet. So when we're talking about a lot of this conversation, I will say in Cincinnati is also about affordable housing. What does it really mean, right? And when we say affordable housing, there's those of you, many of you I suspect are in this sector, right? So you know the shorthand, what we mean by that. But for everyday citizens and for a lot of folks who maybe are not as attuned to these issues, they view affordable housing as sort of a negative thing, right? It suggests has connotations that are not favorable to the community in the way that we know housing affordability absolutely needs to be part of that conversation. So everyone needs to not be cost burdened, right? Regardless of your income. That's the conversation we're trying to push towards here, is to say, this is about how much of your monthly income are you spending on housing? And if there's a crisis, what happens, right? So as we see the winding down of the resources that have been available, particularly to renters around emergency rental assistance and foreclosure supports, et cetera, I think we're on the precipice of sort of a new phase to see how households weather this experience and what do we need to do and respond both from the housing side and from the wages side to make sure that our neighbors are being provided. So this chart is something that people always really seem to resonate with. And again, we're updating these figures, but what this is showing us is the 5 most frequently occurring jobs in the greater Cincinnati MSA, and that only one of them, at this point in time, only one of them got close to the minimum income required to be able to afford a median home price in our market with a mortgage. So we have a really big issue here. And also just from the COVID lens, these were all the jobs, these are the people that were going out and risking their health, their well-being to take care of us when we were at the peak of being at home, and these were folks that were really struggling, and we saw a lot of instability in their housing as a result. So, we are not the only ones talking about housing in this community too. Our regional chamber, the Cincinnati USA Regional Chamber, put together sort of a MSA view, a set of data around regional housing in 2021, which is a great complement to our focus on Hamilton County and Cincinnati to say, again, our housing costs are simply rising faster than our incomes. There was a pretty rapid escalation, and we're not producing housing or preserving the existing affordable housing that we have in a way that's going to help us sustain this growth going forward. We're just not bringing enough new units into the market to absorb. We saw a nice increase in our population here in the city of Cincinnati. I will note that increase in population was an increase in white population and a decrease in Black population, which is another important conversation that we all need to be thinking about in our communities and what that means. But we know we're not bringing enough housing into the market to support folks that want to live in the city and also at price points that make sense to them. So we undertook a really robust planning effort with the support of the University of Pennsylvania's housing initiative at Penn. The team there really provided a lot of the data analysis and the structure and the framing for this with the direction really driven by this set of stakeholders, over 200 participants in this Housing Our Future strategy, to come up with a set of 34 key actions around producing and preserving, which I just mentioned, that affordable housing, protecting our vulnerable residents, and also really looking at systems change and what are the policies, what's the funding mechanisms that need to be in place to really help us move the needle around our housing needs in Cincinnati. So this is all available on our website. You're welcome to look through. I'm going to show you some of the strategy points that we have in each of these categories and talk a little bit about progress in terms of where we have been and where we are making some moves forward. So in the space of production and producing, we have a new mayor in Cincinnati, and his just marked his first year in January of this year, Mayor Aftab Purabal, and a new council that really has focused heavily on housing. They all ran on a platform related to housing and housing affordability, and they're living up to that promise in various ways through providing some important funding mechanisms to help us really address these challenges. Now, you will hear from our counterparts in other cities who have really upped the ante in terms of, meaningfully in terms of investment. We still have some gaps to close here in Cincinnati, I would say, around the public finance side of this work, but we are making progress. We have an affordable housing trust fund that is being resourced both at the city level and by the county through their American Rescue Act funds. So progress forward, considering we went from really only minimal investment in affordable housing to a much bigger set of funds being leveraged and made available in the public space over the last year. So progress in that way. I want to show you this chart too, because I think this is from Embracing Growth, and this really helps us understand that relationship between housing and population growth, and in markets where that are comparable to ours. And you could see Cincinnati, we're sort of down there in that bottom third, and it's not where we want to be. We have to produce more housing and produce housing in a variety of price points where we can to really accommodate our growth and keep moving us towards our peer cities. So production, just a few successes here I want to touch on. We have seen some bigger numbers of units coming online over the last 2 years. A lot of this is mixed use or mixed income, which is a great step forward. And it's also in the center city and in neighborhoods. So we are starting to really see that transition point of more units being produced, but we can't neglect preserving the affordable housing that we do have. So these are some of the key strategies that are priorities of Housing Our Future in terms of how we support both rental housing and homeowners. How do we support homeowners, particularly legacy homeowners, homeowners in neighborhoods that have seen a precipitous increase in their property values over the last few years because of development coming into their place, because of rehabs and renovations and the desirability of these communities because of their location, proximity to downtown, et cetera. We really want to make sure we're thinking about how we support existing moderate to low income homeowners and making sure that they can stay in their homes, right? And that the tax burden, that the repairs, any code enforcement violations they might experience, that we're really lifting up how to support those issues. And I will also mention, I don't know if I have a slide on this, but there's a complementary sort of set of recommendations called the Roadmap to Black Homeownership that grew out of Housing Our Future, that's really focused on how do we, again, preserve particularly Black homeownership in many of our legacy neighborhoods, but also how do we increase that? We, of course, have a 20+ percentage point gap in Black and white homeownership in Cincinnati, and that has to be addressed. So really focusing on that is a critical part of this work. We have, I'll just make a note in terms of what's happening now in this space. The city of Cincinnati has put forward a lawsuit against a fairly large property owner here who is in many accounts pretty neglectful of many of their single family rental properties. The city is getting pretty aggressive around this, and I think it's really going to be interesting to see how that tracks, because we know at a state level that the legislature is concerned about investors purchasing properties in many of our markets. We need to figure out what the strategy is there to try to minimize that, because we are losing home ownership as a result, and also just the negative impact that poor landlords, particularly REITs and other investors that just don't take care of their properties well, the impact that has on everyone around them and on the renters. So I will also make a note, I don't think I have it on a slide. We have very interesting, many of you have probably seen this, our Port Authority, which also holds the land bank for Hamilton County, has purchased a portfolio of 194 single family homes around the county from an investor out of receivership. It was an investor that was moving out of the market, and they are working on preserving the renters where they can, converting folks to home ownership if that's a path they would like to take, and really bringing these properties back into productive use. It's a pretty interesting and exciting and hazardous endeavor that we're all sort of watching in real time and supporting to figure out, is this something that we can replicate in other markets? But they use their bonding authority to be able to purchase this portfolio. So the financing tools have to be there, right, in order for us to actually be able to move in and bring properties back into local control. We want to protect our vulnerable neighbors. These are some of the strategies. Again, we're looking at what does the city is undertaking a tenant bill of rights to understand what types of supports can really help support our renters more effectively and protect those. And we think that there's some good opportunity here to really help support vulnerable neighbors through some of the policy changes. In terms of the systems change, this is really where the rubber meets the road, folks, right? I mean, we have to, this is not just us chipping away on the edges of bringing 4 or 5 new units into each neighborhood over the next 10 years. We need to bring 20,000 new units into Cincinnati, specifically targeted for incomes under 80% AMI, to really close this gap. So that requires some pretty bold system change. I mentioned some of what's happening now at the city of Cincinnati. Also, Hamilton County has really stepped in to bring more resource to jurisdictions in their network that want to respond effectively to the housing needs of their current neighbors. And how do we really mobilize that, especially in this infrastructure of what's happening at the state, and how OFA is able to use tools in their toolkit, and how cities are at a bit of a disadvantage right now in many ways in terms of how those tools get allocated. So we're really trying to figure out what we do at a local level to enhance the existing resources that the state is providing, and make those really stretch further. So I just left a meeting talking about the city of Cincinnati undertaking a pretty comprehensive zoning reform strategy. We're in the midst of community engagement around that right now. It's going to be an interesting ride. So I encourage you to watch the news over the next few months and see what's happening and send us good thoughts that we can move away from only single family zoning in lots of the city and also in the county. But it's going to be a bit of a real enticing conversation, I think, as we move through that. And this all costs money, right? As everyone in this group knows, this is not, housing is not you can't just throw $1 million at it and think we're going to fix all the problems. And so we're really working collectively with other CDFIs, with our banking partners, with philanthropy, with corporate, to say we have to marshal more resources towards this. Public sector dollars can be first in, they can take the most risk, but we need private sector investment and sustained investment in order for us to close this gap. So there are some really interesting tools that we are deploying or getting ready to deploy through the city's Affordable Housing Trust Fund. And then there's sort of a larger fund around that that supports the county that our partner Cincinnati Development Fund is managing. And so they have started to leverage, as you can see here, this is a little dated, but these are some of the private and public resources that they're bringing into the mix to try to get us a set of resources to really provide that suite of housing needs that we want to address. So as I mentioned, all of this is available on our website. We're actually having a webinar next week featuring Mayor Aftab Piraval and the Hamilton County Commission President Alicia Reese to talk about how they view the successes of 2022 and where they want to go in 2023. So you can register for that if you'd like to learn more about what's happening in Cincinnati, and I'll be hosting that. So you can hear me again, and this is me. So again, any way we can provide more information or context, don't hesitate to reach out. And I'm going to pass it back to, I don't know, Amy, if you're introducing next or.
Thank you very much, Kristen.
Thank you.
We're now going to move from the banks of the Ohio up north to the Cuyahoga River and Lake Erie and the city of Cleveland, which also has a new mayor. And our speaker is Mikkel Wackers, who's the Assistant Director of the City of Cleveland's Department of Housing and Community Development. Take it away.
Thank you. Let me just share my screen. I hope you guys can see that. But yeah, City of Cleveland, like Cincinnati, we are in the process of implementing a housing plan. The Planning and Zoning Commission, the Planning Commission approved it in December 2021, and we sort of concluded the first year of implementation. But this was an effort to really try and provide some strategy on how the city can tackle what is really a decades-long disinvestment process. We needed to sort of have a overall umbrella of a strategy that can help sort of guide people in the right direction. And as a result of that, in trying to determine what that looked like, we did extensive engagement for over a year throughout the city of Cleveland, interviewing stakeholders. We did actually a really impressive survey of over 2,000 residents. It's the first survey where I've actually seen the results being predominantly from people of color and people who are low and moderate income, as opposed to white and affluent. We surveyed developers, had focus groups, public meetings, advisory committee, and public meetings to really vet and trying to get this umbrella strategy right for Cleveland. There's a link there. You can see the whole plan yourself at the short URL at the EO 139. But I'll go over sort of the highlights of the plan. And just like Cincinnati, we sort of played on the protect, preserve, produce, and then we added a fourth P into that alliteration called position. So these, we were looking to support housing in these four pillars. Protect, obviously, is to protect households, those who are at risk of unstable housing or high cost housing and displacement, and trying to create the policies and programs that will help support them and keep them stably housed. In the preserve pillar, we're looking at really preserving existing housing, not just affordable housing, but existing housing across the city, making it safe and making it livable, making it free of lead. We also are looking at the third pillar of producing housing. The city of Cleveland has really been disinvested in housing for a very long time, to the point where our housing stock is really not competitive anymore to attract residents. We see that there's a real need to produce housing across all types, not just affordable, but really all kinds of housing in the city of Cleveland, so that we can retain and attract population. And then finally, position. Really through this whole process, it became very clear that the city was not positioned to really tackle this large issue of housing in the city of Cleveland. And we are looking at a variety of ways on how to address that. And that sort of also goes into the capacity issue at the bottom. But overall of this, there was a lot of discussion on what equity within housing looks like. And we are starting to implement some policy changes as a result, which I'll expound upon later. One of the big takeaways from this plan is that we actually put numbers on the need. A lot of the efforts beforehand were really positioned as pilot projects and testing various theories. But I think the state of housing in the city of Cleveland has gotten to a point where we really need to think strategically and at scale, as opposed to trying to test various ideas. So under the protect pillar, we have a goal of protecting 35,600 housing units and families. That can be in the form of rental assistance, which we were very fortunate to have through the pandemic, and we are looking at how that can sort of be sustained into the future with other resources, not the same scale, but really trying to address those most in need, providing down payment assistance, affordable home loans, property tax exemptions. We have an initiative in the city, not so spearheaded by the city, but by a coalition. They're looking at ways to create loop reform for the state of Ohio, because the city itself can't implement it. And then finally, also just for housing and housing protections, renter protections that need to be put in place. The city of Cleveland has actually implemented a couple of those in the past year. We also need to preserve 41,400 housing units. That's the number, if we do nothing over the next 10 years, that's the number of housing units that will fall into disrepair, that will likely become a cost burden to the city as a possible demolition project down the road. We know that through some interventions, there is, and creating programs that can tackle this will ultimately be a savings for the city of Cleveland down the road if we can do that effectively. And that includes home repair assistance, compassionate code enforcement, but also involves the rental registration and lead certifications that we require to the city of Cleveland now, and how to make those effective in order to be address these issues. And then finally, under the produce pillar, we need to produce 23,000 housing units over the next year. Mostly in the affordable range, but we also see that there's a need in other areas in order to be able to attract population. We have a new director of community development, and she had a very difficult time trying to find housing that meet her needs when she came from Florida to the city of Cleveland. And when that's not a unique story, that's a story that we hear over and over again in the city of Cleveland. And that's a competitive disadvantage at this point for the city of Cleveland, even though we have a great location and a great workforce. If we can't house that workforce adequately, it's hard to attract big projects like Sherwin-Williams or others that you might think of. So how are we implementing this from a policy perspective? The numbers were really helpful. The other thing we got to do is really sort of simplify what the housing need looked like across the city. And this map is sort of a representation of that. There's been a lot of neighborhood sort of typologies done in the city of Cleveland. Some of them with as many as a dozen or more different housing or typography types. But we really wanted to make this as usable and clear, so that when it comes to policymakers or developers and when we're trying to roll out programs, that we can clearly identify what goes where. It doesn't replace zoning, but it does allow us to target incentives, grants, loans, and other efforts in areas of need. So the purple is sort of the opportunity areas. Those are traditionally what we would consider distressed neighborhoods, but we think that there's, those are underinvested portions of the city. Then you have our middle market neighborhoods. Those are markets that are on the edge of either thriving or becoming distressed, and they need special interventions. And then finally, the market rate areas of the city, which obviously are doing fairly well, but need to be more inclusive and need some attention to how you create the type of housing so that you can have mixed income neighborhoods throughout the city. And I'll just remember these colors, and this sort of feeds through some of the next slides. And when you look at our housing gap financing program, we looked at how can we change our gap financing program and tier it in a way that can address the needs of these unique neighborhoods. So in the purple, we have higher levels of subsidy for affordable housing development. We also have higher levels of subsidy depending on the developer type. So if you're a minority or women developer, or if you're a TODA organization, you have access to higher resources than you would if you were not one of those. And then permanent supportive housing anywhere in the city gets the highest level of assistance as a result. Furthermore, we passed a residential tax abatement program to replace our previous one this past year. And in the same vein, we looked at implementing how can we address housing through our incentives. So what we did is actually in our distressed or opportunity markets, they get the highest tax abatement possible. And also with the least number of sort of other requirements associated in the program. Then our middle markets get a different standard, a little less generous. And then our market rate areas are also a little less generous than the other two areas. For multifamily, we're also requiring now, if you want to get a tax abatement, a set aside of you need sort of middle income or affordable housing units within your project. And then you might also be required to do some sort of community benefits agreement in order to ensure that your project has other benefits that the community can benefit from. We are also looking at sort of lending reform. The city of Cleveland has a community reinvestment ordinance. It's been on the books for a number of decades now, but it really has not been an effective tool for the city. And we are really looking at how we can change this approach. One of the things we're moving away from is the banks were always sort of voluntarily reporting their numbers and creating their own goals into the program, which would dictate the agreements we entered into. We are now doing our own analysis of what HAMDA says, the publicly available home mortgage information, and seeing how their lending patterns exist across the city, and really trying to distill it all down onto one page. So when we present this to policymakers, to banks, they can quickly understand, okay, here are the challenges we need to work on. So this is an example. I blacked out the bank's name, but we're currently working with 3 banks. And this has really changed the conversation. As opposed to them sort of pitching all the great things they believe they're doing, we're talking about the challenges and how can we be a partner in crafting an approach to address those. And also we're currently, ARPA has been sort of a once in a lifetime opportunity for the city. We are currently have 1 RFP out for affordable and market rate investments, totaling $34 million in available resources across 5 different pools of funding, $10 million for affordable housing gap financing, $5 million for market rate housing gap financing, $13.7 million of home ARP, which is sort of homeless related affordable housing, $4 million for non-congregate shelter gap financing, and then $1.5 million for single family affordable or market rate financing. We also have an additional $33 million of other funding that's been authorized, and we plan to issue an RFP for that. But that is targeted less for projects and more for creating pools of funding with partners to do affordable housing, market rate housing, home repair, small minority developer acquisition and rehab, in order to address a larger array of issues. In the RFP, we did 3 public or voluntary information sessions. We had over 180 participants, easily from over 100 different developers, locally, regionally, and across the country, looking at Cleveland. And we hope that creates a sort of a tangible interest for a second ask of ARPA funding from the City Council. And then finally, under capacity, the department has been actively implementing a new digital platform for grants management called Neighborly. It's been a year in the process, and we're almost finished. We'll be finished probably by the end of the spring, and it completely digitizes everything that was paper-based in our department. Before this, we had some database and technology, but largely the processes all had some sort of paper component to it. It was really antiquated. It was hard to get projects done, get contracts to where they needed to be in a reasonable time frame. But now everything is online. Applications are online, contracting is online, payments and reporting is online, and this is going to work for our grants, our loan programs, tax abatement, and land bank. So you can get your money, your incentives, and your land all through one portal through the city of Cleveland. And we're really hoping that will bring us into the 21st century as opposed to the 1970s. And that is the last slide that I have, and I'm be happy to turn it over to the next presenter.
Thank you, Miguel. So we're going from Cincinnati and Cleveland now to our fastest growing city in Ohio, Columbus. And our third speaker is Carly Booth, who is Executive Director of the Affordable Housing Alliance of Central Ohio, which includes the city of Columbus. So Carly, it's your turn.
Well, thank you. I'm gonna, I think, follow pretty much the same pattern. We'll talk a little bit about where the region sits right now for our housing needs before segueing to kind of how we've been able to impact that and what we've got on the horizon. I tend to be pretty casual though, so I think that if you've got things that are really pressing, feel free to dump them in the chat and I'll try and respond to them as I'm going through these. So I think the data is relatively similar with the other urban regions. But if you live in a suburban community or even to a greater extent a township or a rural area, there are elements of this that are going to resonate. That the housing challenge that we've got in Franklin County is something that is palpable throughout the state. In Franklin County alone, we have 54,000 households that are paying more than half of their income towards housing. That's both rent and the mortgage. I know other folks have talked about this, but we call that the toxic trade-off range. Because once you are making that kind of sacrifice for your housing, you are inevitably giving something away that you need to survive. It is food, it is medicine, it is intangibles. You see more and more parents who work 2 or 3 extra jobs to be able to pay the rent, which means that that's time that they don't get to spend at home with their kids and to be kind of present in their lives. And that's something that, like I said, 54,000 of our neighbors are facing. We also are growing rapidly and in some ways scarily. We know from research the Building Industry Association has done that just to keep up with demand, right? Just to lock in the housing crisis as bad as it is today without letting it get worse. We're not talking about solving, but just to lock it in. We should be building about 21,000 homes every year in our region. And we ain't. I mean, even in our best days, we are building probably half of what that looks like. It is a workforce challenge, as Amy said, locally, both Franklin County, Delaware, Fairfield, kind of all of our peer communities in the area, you need to earn about $20 an hour to be able to afford the rent. But that is a pressure, obviously, that's felt a lot more unevenly by those who are the lower income scale. We only have 32 affordable and available homes for every 100 ELI families who need them. And of course, Intel is kind of the monster in the room that we can't go to any meeting anywhere. We can't get coffee without talking about Intel. But it's not Intel, right? It's the Silicon Heartland movement that I think has people really paying attention. Yes, Intel is going to bring about 10,000 jobs relatively overnight in terms of planning scale. But we're also looking at Honda and Marysville and major expansions there. And we're looking at all of the creative industries and supply chains that are going to congregate towards those opportunities, and then the tertiary effects that are going to come with those. So we could be looking at tens of thousands of new jobs and tens of thousands of new families coming into the region, which is why we're projecting hitting a 3 million person population by 2050, which is well ahead of what previous estimates had. On the topic of how much we are building, I think it is important to start with where are we holding ground? And there's not a lot of great news there. just since 2017, when the Alliance was formed, that's kind of our benchmark year. That's when we began working as an organization. We've lost 37,000 houses that used to rent for $900 a month or less and no longer do. And if you're familiar with the greater Columbus region, we're not tearing things down anymore. This isn't demolition. This isn't removing of housing stock. This is rents going out. And that's that $900 a month, I think, is important because, at least in my mind, and I think those millennial, perhaps, practitioners, that's affordable for a workforce. That's an entry level. That's when we were coming of age. $900 a month felt very reasonable. And those rents are no longer existing. We're seeing entry level wages or entry level rents move up towards $1,100, $1,200, $1,300 a month now. And when it does come to building, I look at it as kind of a reflection of where we sit among our peer cities. And Columbus has grand ambitions about being, the next big trendy thing. I think we are the next big trendy thing. But if you juxtapose us against Austin or Nashville or Denver, Colorado, you can see both in raw construction starts as well as construction starts per capita, we're well behind all of our peers, including Des Moines, Iowa, who has a fraction of the population. I tend to talk quite a bit about multifamily and rental issues because we know that's where the ELI need tends to start, but it's not the end of the conversation either. We are also an organization that focuses on home ownership and being able to protect and promote that opportunity. This slide is brand new numbers from this morning. Our median home sale price is now $260,000, a little bit of change. If you just make standard assumptions about taxes and insurance, that's going to be a PITI of $2,400 a month. And what that means is the median resident can no longer afford the median home. And I think in that kind of tipping point area, we also know that the median renter across the country is now cost burdened. As a nation, we have shifted to the place where being housing insecure is now the norm. And I think that's why you're seeing so many people catalyze around this issue, is it is touching all of us in one way or another. I think about this because the Alliance is very economically oriented. We are somebody who looks at housing through the lens of economic development and the opportunities for wage and job growth. To be able to buy this median home while working at minimum wage, you would need to have 5.5 full-time jobs. And what that means is you need to work all day, every day, and then create new days in the week to be able to buy that median home. Obviously, evictions are something that has grown over the course of the pandemic. In Franklin County in particular, we are now well exceeding pre-pandemic eviction rates. We are in fact now exceeding Great Recession eviction rates. This is something that we have never seen to this scale. And I will note that last year we had over 20,000 evictions filed, but we were able to pull a lot of those households back from the brink because we had emergency rent assistance funding. Those resources, we are optimistic will be able to continue through the year. If we look at reallocations, we look at how we keep funding inside the state of Ohio, but they will not last forever. And I think as housing advocates, we are trying to understand what eviction filing rates will mean when we no longer have crisis funding to be able to help folks who are facing that. I could go through for, days and days talking about how there are disparities inside all of these different metrics when it comes to race and ethnicity, as well as gender and family status. A few of those are up on the screen, but I am always happy to kind of go offline and talk about them more fully too. And I do want to kind of make the hard shift. That's a lot of doom and gloom, that those are not fun numbers. This is not an enviable position to be in. But I do think that the greater Columbus region absolutely can get ahead of this, that we can solve it. And no offense to my peers, I think we can be the first in the state and the first in the country to really address our affordable housing needs comprehensively and fully. I don't think this is a runaway train. I think we can do this. We are part of that system. We are part of that ecosystem. The Alliance is a membership organization. We have 29 members. You can see some of those listed here on the screen, but it's really intentionally curated to have experts from different parts of the housing system. We have those who work in homelessness and emergency crisis response and eviction prevention, who are kind of closest and rawest towards those who are, I think, in the most jeopardy. But we also have folks who work in financing. We have members who are philanthropists, who are grant makers. We have members that work in single family homeownership and develop homes or create the mortgage lending products that first time home buyers need. So that's really intentional because our work tends to be around research and analysis and program development. And we need to be able to have that kind of full spectrum of experts advising us as we move forward. And then, a fair amount of our work is also in advocacy and making sure that we're kind of cheerleader in chief for the community. Again, I'm always happy to talk about who AHACO is and what we do. I'll just note very quickly that, again, we are in a not necessarily unique space where part of our housing challenge is we just don't have the homes. We're at about 98% occupancy for our residential housing stock. That's essentially zero occupancy. Our homes are full of people and there are more people coming and we need more homes. And there's no way you can slice that number differently. But in looking at that sheer inventory challenge, we can't lose the intangibles that homeownership brings and the opportunity that gives for wealth creation and family stability and how that interconnects with community development and having safe neighborhoods that people want to live in. And then we also look, like I said, at housing through an economic lens. And we ask ourselves, how can we use affordable housing as a platform to help people graduate out of the housing need? Instead of just creating 54,000 homes, can we create 26,000 and then help the other 26,000 folks increase their income so that they can afford what's available on the market? None of these levers can work alone. We have to look at all of them together at the same time. And we look at this work through the lenses of diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice, as well as being a representative for the community. We are a membership organization, but it just is not my job to make our members more money. It's kind of my job to put them out of business, which is a weird thing to tell your boss. But our clientele, our focus is the residents of the area. Some of the successes we've had, either fully launched, wholly successful, ready for replication and expansion, or in some phase of development. The first is the Housing Action Fund. This is now about 3 years old. It's a $100 million loan pool. It's public-private partnership. We have capital from the city and the county in it, as well as from some of our major investors in the region, everyone from CareSource to Huntington Bank to Park National Bank to Nationwide. It's a real team effort, but it's $100 million of flexible capital, of patient capital, of quick strike capital when needed that can really leverage the low-income housing tax credit program and other funding streams at a sub-market interest rate so that we are more competitive as we are going out for these development opportunities. The big headline, I think, out of Columbus is that we just approved through a voter initiative, a $200 million affordable housing bond package, which in and of itself was the extension of a $50 million bond package that had been approved in 2019. We saw that first pilot did a ton of good. It did multifamily development. It did single family community land trust development. It was able to support permanent supportive housing and addressing homelessness needs. It was a really diverse tool. And as we move forward with this next indenture, we're really stoked for it to be able to be even more diverse and responsive. So beginning to layer in home repair opportunities, or perhaps looking towards our friends in Cincinnati and looking at how we can use these resources to acquire at-risk portfolios that are currently affordable, but might not be if we don't act quickly. All of that is to be written, but a really exciting time to do the work. We also have the Resiliency Bridge program, which is just ending its first year in operation. The concept is that if you are willing to invest in yourself and to invest in your education and to get a workforce credential in a high pay, high demand field, these kinds of careers of the future, we're going to make sure that housing isn't the thing that slows you down. We will pay your rent, we will pay your utilities, we will pair you with case management and wraparound supports for the duration of your education program and for a wind-off period after, so that you can be successful. And what this really came down to is we had too many people that were killer workers. They were fantastic at their jobs, but they were capped out of where they could get raises and where they could get promotions unless they had a piece of paper saying they were ready for the next step. And they couldn't get that paper because they had too many things on their calendar that they were juggling between family and work. They needed just a little bit of extra help to get over those barriers. And that's what this does. We originally thought we were able to serve about 60 people in the first phase of the pilot. We are now well over 75 households that have enrolled. We've got about 25 folks who've graduated. Every single one of those kind of early stage graduates came in earning between $0 and just a smidge above minimum wage. Many fought to get full-time hours. I think that was something that Amy flagged. You might be able to get a full-time wage, but if you don't get the hours, it doesn't matter. Of those first 25 graduates, the information we have now shows that every single one of them is employed full-time with benefits, earning between $20 and $25 an hour. And many of them are in these career fields that have an on-ramp to $100,000 a year gigs in the next couple of years. It's early. We're waiting for the official evaluation results. But I think that this is just not only replicable and impactful, but probably something that could shift to a social impact bond model of funding, because we are taking people off of public benefits and giving them self-sufficiency. Or rather, I should say they are taking themselves off and giving themselves self-sufficiency. They're the ones doing the hard work. We just make it a little bit easier. I'm going to blow through these last couple. I mostly just want to kind of showcase them a little bit, but I don't want to go into too much depth because each of these could be, full day discussions as well. Convergence Columbus is a project that we've brought under the Alliance's umbrella in the last year to close the Black and minority homeownership gaps in our community. It's got a lot of tails coming off of it. We are doing work on a consumer-facing website that would provide more transparency and resource referrals to people who are ready for homeownership, or for those who are near ready and don't quite know where to go next. We are looking at down payment assistance products and other direct supports to help people close the gap between mortgage ready and not mortgage ready. And we are looking at systems alignment and how we better bring industry professionals like realtors, brokers, lenders, and housing counselors into the same page so we can have a really supportive ecosystem for residents. It's fantastic. I love it. If you haven't met Karina Johnson, she's the program director for the program, and we just love her to pieces too. On the policy front, there are two initiatives that we felt, our region couldn't be successful, not just during COVID and during pandemic evictions, but for the long haul, without making sure they were part of the portfolio. The first is source of income discrimination ordinances, preventing landlords from being able to decline somebody housing because of how they earn lawful, verifiable, sustainable income. And the other is pay to stay. Again, it had a lot of relevancy during COVID, but what we have found now, because our landscape is changing so fast, because rents are increasing so quickly, is that we are facing a lot of gentrification pressures. And if somebody tries to pay their rent with, a donation from their church or from their bridge club, the landlords are saying no, because they would rather evict that person and raise the rents. Pay to stay is not the permanent fix for that, but it gives us an opportunity for our market to catch up. And then we also have launched the Rentful 614 website, which has become the landing page for all things eviction prevention in our community. Easy to access information, really hardcore referrals to the right place for the right person. And it's something that, again, was kind of born of the pandemic, but is going to have a lot of longevity afterwards as well. And zoning is in its infancy stages here in the city of Columbus, but we're working with a zoning code that was written in the 1950s. And it's been tweaked and adjusted, and it's a franking code that has been modified 6 ways to Sunday ever since. And it's time for a fresh outlook and something that really puts us in the right spot for the future. Tons of upside for affordable housing. And frankly, no cost. There's no hard budget associated with this. We don't need to raise $200 million for zoning reform. You just need the right technical experts and the right engagement to really have a big impact.
No, but thanks. Thank you.
And, you know, Cleveland and Michael and the work that you were doing around ARPA is the stuff of inspiration. We've asked rhetorically and sometimes less rhetorically, what would it look like if we went down that path? And we tell our residents and we tell our clients all day, every day, you should spend 30% of your income on housing. That's what's affordable. That's an investment in you. If we held ourselves to that same standard as a community and our budgets reflected that and our ARPA investments reflected that, how would that move us forward? It's something that we are still talking about. We don't have clear direction yet, but it's something that I think is going to be really critical for us to kind of seize the moment. Just a sneak peek, we do a lot of data. We love numbers. We love research. We're going to have a new infographic coming out by the end of the month. That's kind of a fancy book with report with tons of pictures on what the intersections are between housing and health. And that will be here in a few days. It's very, very neat. Our intern, Kayla Johnson, who I'm very sad to say will be graduating and not our intern in a few months, did all of the heavy lifting. And I think she's very interested in coming to Cleveland. So again, if you are looking for a real go-getter, I'm going to be very sad to lose her, but she's killer. I think that's it. Yeah. Happy to answer questions. I'll kind of graze through the chat now too.
Well, thank you, Carly, and our other speakers. I think they, in about 15 minutes, covered a lot of ground in terms of the challenges that these cities face. We could spend the entire time on one city, much less three. I think before we go to the chat, and we had a lot of comments and questions, which Nash is going to bring up, I'm going to ask our four panelists if they would care to make either brief comments as a follow-up or to ask any of the other speakers about what they heard from them, even though a lot of the information, as you said, is going to be on the websites, but give you a chance to first off say a little bit more, about half an hour for the rest of the program. Any takers? No? Let me ask one general question before we do the chat then. Even though I think you would all say financing and money available is critical to whatever cities can do, wherever the money comes from. If you had to advise other cities about one component, whether it's human or otherwise, that cities should focus their efforts on, what might that be? How about you, Carly?
Zoning reform all day, every day. I mean, I can't go back to it enough, but most of the zoning codes in the state were written in different eras. There's a group that was written in the 50s, there's a group that was written in the 70s, and there was a group that was written in the 1990s. So unless your thing is segregation, disco balls, or McMansions, there's a very good chance that your code does not reflect your values. And in a lot of our country, not just Ohio, it is almost impossible to build the kind of housing that people want. Like, I'm Central Ohio. So if you look at where our markets are dictating that we have the most interest in housing, it's mixed use, mixed income, mixed tenure communities. It's folks like Clintonville or Marion Village or Italian Village, these kind of old 1900 era neighborhood types. If you had a green field in the middle of nowhere that was a blank slate, it would be illegal to recreate those communities on it because they're too dense, or there is insufficient parking, or the setbacks aren't wide enough. So what people want, builders are no longer able to deliver, and that is a function of the regulation around housing.
Kristen, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, zoning is certainly at the top of our list. I also think community will. This is a very divisive issue, right? And we do a lot of othering in the housing affordability conversation. It's somebody else's problem. It's not, this isn't relative to me. And And that creates a lot of, it makes it difficult for some of the policy changes that we know need to happen at the local jurisdiction level. It makes them a lot harder to get across the finish line. And so I think that there's a lot of conversation about, this notion of, well, people just need to make more money and then they can afford the house that they want and need, which we know is not true, right? So, that's been a big part of our educational outreach in this first sort of 18 months around Housing Our Future, is just trying to level set and help people understand that this isn't folks that aren't trying hard enough. This is people that are fueling our economy and keeping us going, and that there are a lot of housing challenges for people who are in that space of the community. So
Here we go.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with both of those comments. Definitely the planning, the zoning, since my background is in planning. But I think the conversation about housing really needs to circle around that. It's economic development first and foremost, in my opinion. It's if you can house your workforce in safe, quality housing, that addresses a lot of other issues your workforce will be faced with. Here in Cleveland, our workforce is living in typically 90-year-old or older housing stock with lead paint. That's unstable in many ways. It's the quality is not what you're paying for. It's just housing of last resort in many cases. All those people at any income spectrum should be well housed in quality, safe housing, and in turn, that means you're going to have quality of workers that can attract other industries to your city. I don't think that connection really is stressed enough.
And finally, Amy, if you had your wish list, top of your wish list for the state of Ohio to assist these cities to address affordable housing beside lots of cash, what might it be?
I think there's a great infrastructure across the state of Ohio to help communities be business friendly. And we're reaping the rewards of that right now. In the creation of Jobs Ohio, it really kind of created a uniform and standardized playing field of how communities could attract economic development and how we could compete with other states in that area. We need the same type of infrastructure, the same type of technical assistance, capacity building support for communities to be housing friendly. And how can cities work not just in a silo, but within coordination of each other to be able to build the housing that's necessary and to flex resources when it is needed. And so I think if there was more coordination and support in that area, it would be able to elevate the conversation more across the state.
Thank you. Okay, Natasha, why don't you take us through the chat, and if they're simply comments, I think we'll just look at them, but if there are questions, I'll call on one of our speakers to respond, and I think we have time to probably go through most of the chat ones. So could you show us those, please?
Sure. Okay, you want me to share the screen with the questions, or?
Right, yeah, if you can share the screen.
Okay,
so
sure.
all see them.
Know if that's too large. Can you see the questions?
Yep.
Okay.
Okay, here we go.
I just put them in order of the questions I was during the.
Fine. Okay. Well, we have 4 policy wonks here. We can't call on all of you, but does one of you want to respond to this first one about the loss of affordable housing? Anybody want to comment on that one?
I mean, I cut my teeth in the Great Recession. My first gig at a law school was as a defense counsel for homeowners facing foreclosure. And in particular, kind of the high profile scams and people who had really been preyed upon both before and during that crisis. I think that there was an assumption that housing can never be broken, that demand will always continue to go up, and no matter what sort of unsultry behavior there is, the market will find a way to correct itself. So if there's a lesson that I take away from it in pieces, is that the market is not infallible, that these things need oversight in a reasonable and rational way. And they need housing professionals who can say, here's what my experiences is on the ground, and how do we get the funding and the regulatory support that we need to make sure that these abuses are curbed.
Thank you. Okay, the second one has already been answered, so let's go to Nina McCollum's comment. Let's see. Boarding houses. There's also in some states accessible dwelling units as at least an approach if they're authorized.
So
You want to?
maybe the lawyer wants to answer this, but as for my planning background, I think there is a desire to see some sort of housing stock that can be much more flexible and more like SROs, single resident occupancy. Mostly not so much that it's a component of your housing stock, but it's a solution to the homelessness issue, either through transitional or really as a permanent supportive housing model. So I think that is certainly being reevaluated and looked at. Unfortunately, it's a zoning problem. And it needs to really, the community needs to understand the connection between this type of housing is an asset and addresses a particular need that should not be zoned out.
I think one of our speakers also alluded to the elderly aging in place issue, because Ohio has one of the older populations of a state in the country, and it's only as an 80-year-old almost. I can appreciate that figure. We're going to have a lot more elderly people. And I think some cities are beginning to at least recognize that if they want to keep the elderly population out of nursing homes, they need to do something about accommodating aging in place. Let's see, let's go down to the Home Repair Resource Center. And I think, Mikhail, this is for you. Banking depository contracts to leverage investments. Does that ring a bell?
It does. I'm assuming it came up at one of the budget hearings, but this has been in conversations as well. So the city of Cleveland, and I don't think it's unique to Cleveland, but we obviously hold our tax dollars with local banks, and we try and use that as a way to also encourage the banks to do other programming. We are exploring ways to better leverage that relationship, and one of the ways is that the bank, we might not need, say, $5 million this year, but we could put it into a certificate of deposit, and the interest could be used to help support a bank initiative that would directly benefit something through the city of Cleveland. It might help to reduce interest rates on loans, or reduce interest rates on lines of credit to contractors, or loans to people doing down payment assistance. There is the city is really needs to re-engage the banks, and that's sort of a bigger conversation, but there's 16 that have local retail institutions in the city of Cleveland. We have agreements with none of them today. And moreover, the lending industry, there's around 700 entities that lend within the city of Cleveland. And many of those are large mortgage brokers, Rocket Mortgage, Loan Depot. Those really, we also don't have any engagement, but we depend on them for services. And unfortunately, sometimes those services are not, given throughout the city equally. So we need to really understand how this, as a city, can we work in that space effectively, or how do we have, national approaches that really ensure that people are getting the financial services they need.
Okay, in terms of Brian's point, Amy, I think you mentioned, particularly with the COVID restrictions apparently on their way to be discontinued federally. And the fear that a lot of the rental assistance programs that these cities have used and the state might either disappear altogether or at least be severely cut. Do you have any thoughts about either what might be done to prevent that or to somehow substitute other state or local assistance that cities can use for those numbers we saw from the presentations of people that are paying over 30% or 50% of their income for housing?
Yes, so I would say this group is in somewhat of a unique position because I think the resources for rental assistance, though they will be inconsistent and spotty, will remain within the 3 Cs longer than they will within many other communities across the state. The state of Ohio, for the balance of state, has set an end to the program in December of 2023, even though the federal regs allow for the emergency rental assistance to continue until 2025. So money can be reallocated from other parts of the country, from other parts of the state, and communities that are in position who have mainly spent their money can take in more dollars. And so Cleveland, Cincinnati, and Columbus have all been in a great position to receive some of those reallocated dollars and to support more individuals within their community. I think each of the speakers brought this up about tenant protections and source of income protection, right to counsel, pay to stay, all of these types of activities that can help protect renters. And as we look forward, one of the things that we have to think about is that a lot of communities have housing choice vouchers or Section 8 vouchers that are available and are being assigned to a household and then are not able to be deployed in community because of the lack of landlords accepting those payments. And so we have federal resources that are allocated, that are ready for our communities, and we can't get them out into the community because the private market, this is supposed to be a public-private partnership, the private part of it isn't holding up their end of the deal. And so, yes, we do need some changes to the housing choice voucher pricing point to make them worth more, to make them more flexible. Those are all changes that need to be made. But in the meantime, we do need to help create a more tenant-friendly environment for these products to be used and for the resources to be able to be deployed. There are many conversations about additional federal resources for more subsidy to be put into communities. But I think as the federal government is looking at the slow deployment of current vouchers that are on the street, it's a hard and difficult argument to make. The other thing we're seeing great success in that is limited, but that we're seeing is getting some traction across the state, is direct cash transfers, which are literal cash infusions to individuals who are extremely low income to help them pay for expenses such as housing, food, and other basic necessities. Some of these programs have been related to hospital systems. Ohio has done a pilot program that was funded through the Day One Family Foundation and the Jeff Bezos Group. And these direct cash transfers have been seen to be very effective in helping families to make the right decisions about how to close this gap in severe rent and cost burden so that they are able to afford their housing and be flexible with the extremely fast rising inflationary rates.
And we just had this question, so why don't you address maybe a shallow subsidy versus a not shallow subsidy? Do you want to explain that?
I
think they must be referring to the amount allowable for the housing assistance programs.
I guess this is I'm not exactly sure like how this is being asked.
So it's a concept that's been talked about in Cleveland and Cuyahoga. The county, I think, had a study that included this term. The idea was we might not be able to fund a program to get everyone to 30% of area medium income, sort of the subsidy of that gap. But what is doable, and the at least will make that gap more shallow. So you might get them to 40%, you might get them to 50%. At least it's not as challenging as it was. But and I think that was an effort to try and be make it affordable program locally and what was politically possible. And but even that has been a challenge.
Thank you.
Well, I think too that we've looked at shallow subsidies in the ERA context of instead of paying 100% of the rent, if you only need a portion to get it to a place that's affordable, that will allow us to elongate the resources. Again, I think in the COVID pandemic and the era in which that those funds were born, people were unemployed. They had zero income. They needed 100% of rent to be paid. We're just now at that pivot point where we're looking at what that flexibility is. And unfortunately, the resources are winding down at the same time. But I think the Eviction Crisis Prevention Act at the federal level is something that could, find elements of permanence and give us the ability to do that cool work.
And speaking of federal assistance, we should keep in mind, at least for the near future, we have at least two friends in Washington with Senator Sherrod Brown chairing the Senate Banking Committee and former Congresswoman from our area, Marcia Fudge, as the HUD secretary. So hopefully they could relate to our situation in Ohio as well as elsewhere in the country. Let's see, let's roll the chat. Nash, do we have more? Oh, here we go. So what about, I guess, generally homelessness resources and homelessness approaches? I think each of you have programs. I know Housing First has been lauded as a pretty major step forward in Cleveland. Anybody want to comment about approaches to homelessness, either providing housing, temporary or beyond the shelter approach? Or
So I would just point to one promising effort at the state level right now, and that is a recommendation by the governor's office to the Ohio Department of Medicaid to submit a Medicaid waiver that would allow for Medicaid to actually pay for some housing cost for particular populations. Those populations currently include homeless individuals with severe and persistent mental illness or substance use disorder. So what would be the typical PSH type of population, and then also homeless pregnant women. And so this is a new opportunity to be able to pay things like security deposits, utility arrearages, buy starter kits of beds and mattresses and things of that nature, extermination costs, things like that, that would be Medicaid eligible. And with the current state of Medicaid expansion in Ohio, it would cover most people experiencing homelessness. And so I think that is one way that the state has shown that they are taking some innovative approaches to addressing the issue beyond the normal pathways.
And I'll also say too, I think part of what the question was is that there's a new crop of people who are housing insecure who have never been in this spot before, who always consider them middle class, who always consider themselves stable. And navigating the bureaucracy of assistance is daunting and it's embarrassing and it's just hard to get your head around. I put into the chat the link to our Rentful 614 website. When we built that, we used a human-centered design process where we brought in folks who were housing insecure. We also brought in folks who were landlords. And we just kind of popped up shop at the courthouse for 2 days and just listened to people And some of the things that they said, and that you'll see incorporated into the design of the website, not just the language, but how it looks, is that it is not governmental. You don't see red, white, and blue. You don't see official logo seals because they wanted something that was more approachable. And they also said, you know, give me the transparency, right? Don't show me a one-line sentence that says, click here for help. Tell me what to expect. Tell me every step of the process so I can get myself lined up. I think the broader question is, how do you speak to people who've never been housing insecure before, who are now your target audience? Well, you speak to them. You go out and you find out how they like to engage, and you do that.
In terms of Mo's point here, Carly, maybe you could briefly comment about the use of the community land trust, which the city of Columbus and Franklin County have used, and now we have a new community land trust here in Cleveland on the near west side, reducing the cost of housing by keeping land costs extremely low. And I think while it's made small strides, it is being used more around the country. You want to mention what's happened in Franklin County and Columbus?
Yeah, I mean, I can't give enough kudos to the Central Ohio Community Land Trust. This went from 0 to 60 basically overnight. I remember sitting in the mayor's State of the City speech where he said this is going to be a priority. And then just a few months ago, I was celebrating the 100th home that they've built, developed, and sold to an end user. Record speed. You're right that part of that thrust is about taking the speculative nature of land out of home ownership and giving more people an opportunity to get it. Another part for us is being able to find out where we have really fast changing neighborhoods that some might argue are at risk of gentrification, and being able to build workforce housing and opportunity into them. And I think another thing that was kind of a ground floor consideration that, at least when I was a funder, was something that I was thinking about is, when you're doing a straight down payment assistance program, you are just constantly pouring money into the pile, and that equity is walking away with that user, that consumer, which is fantastic. That's one avenue, but it's just not the only avenue. What this does is it ensures public commitment of funding is recyclable, and that they're able to gain the benefit of that one-time investment for generations. Yeah, the land trust, I can't give enough props to Curtis Williams and to Hope Paxson and the group over in Franklin County. They're just doing a bang up job.
Yeah, Nash, you will go to number 8 here. You're gonna scroll down. Okay, I don't know, Amy, if there is
Yeah.
something being done in our legislature, hopefully positive, not negative.
I think we might be moving in the opposite direction, not in a positive one. I think at the legislature, there is some talk about efforts to help protect renters. I think the conversations that are going forward are maybe not quite enough, and they're a little maybe outdated and not up on the times. They're kind of old ideas, if you will. And there is some efforts like eviction expungement that might gain some momentum and be able to have some strength, we are hoping, during this legislature, and might actually move forward even in the idea of just like pure blanket expungements, not necessarily a long legal process for people to get that work done. In the last legislature, they actually passed language in a bill that was meant to just preemptively eliminate the ability for cities to do rent control. But the language was a little bit more aggressive than that, and has the potential to be able to preemptively limit other renter protections that are associated with the lease process of a rental unit. Those are still being tested, which means AKA legal process that is going on. And there are some legislators who are talking about fixing that language in this new legislature. But I think the sentiment is the legislature is in favor of the landlords and the landlord lobbying organizations, and the tenant voices. It's just hard to overwhelm that business force. And so as we think of any of these issues, whether it be the development of more affordable housing, the way we're addressing homelessness, tenant protections, any of these issues, there is a business side to all of this. And that voice is a very loud in Columbus. And any opportunities, any assistance, any way that we can help promote more tenant and human voices in these efforts, we need to do that, and we need to make sure that the voices are heard in Columbus.
So it sounds like the reality is we have to look to cities and counties in Ohio, at least for tenant-oriented reforms to the extent they can do it. Hopefully
Yes,
not the state legislature then preempting what they're trying to do.
we're seeing much more success in cities, even cities that are surprising us, that are taking great efforts. And so keep going, locals, because you're doing great work.
Okay, we got a few minutes left. You want to scroll this Nasha down and see what we've got next?
That was the last one.
That was the last
Everything
one.
else-
Okay.
Yes.
So the
yes.
floor is open for about 5 minutes. If any of our participants want to pose new questions or comments.
I guess while you're waiting to see if there's other questions, I'll just kind of begin to piggyback on what Amy said too, which is that when it comes to tenant protections, I think home rule has a ton of value. That what the world looks like in Cleveland and Columbus and Cincinnati might have some commonalities, but they're not copy and paste. Having the flexibility to do what our people need when they need it is why the state was set up this way. And I look to, for instance, the Housing for All package that Council Member Faber, the chair of the City of Columbus Housing Council, Housing Committee led, which included not just source of income protections, but also something called renter's choice, where now all renters, regardless of income, have the ability to make their security deposit in either 3-month or 6-month installments. And they also included a provision called rent receipt, because we had a very, very, very small minority of property owners who were exploiting immigrant communities, and they were taking rent payments in cash. And then as soon as that person complained about the conditions or the quality of the housing, they would file an immigration complaint and they would mess up their lives. And they would also claim that they never got payment. We didn't get your rent. You show me the receipt. And because they were all cash transactions, that tenant, that consumer had no way to protect themselves. That could very well be a local phenomenon. That doesn't necessarily need to be a blanket rule across the state, but having the flexibility to respond to that situation very quickly and very strongly was important.
Okay, we have a question about funding in Cincinnati. I'll just remind people, particularly those who came in a little late. Each of the speakers pointed out that they have on their websites lots of detailed information, including source of funding for example, the Cincinnati Affordable Housing Trust. And since we're just about out of time, I think you need to go to the websites of the 3 cities, and I'm sure you could probably find answers to most of your questions, if not all. So I want to thank each of our 4 speakers today. I think you provided a lot of great, useful information, and perhaps we can do other cities in Ohio at another time, or look at the state and what it may do in the future also. I'm going to turn back to Chip to wrap this up and talk about any future plans of our forum program.
Well, I want to thank all of our speakers. Tremendous amount of effort. $200 million in Columbus. Who would have believed it? I mean, that's amazing. Go. That's unbelievable. One of my thoughts about this is that we're going to be coming up with our next forum. We're going to be looking at the problem of discrimination and no cause with me fair housing and source of income and landlord tenant rights and stuff like that. But we also have a question, looks like a hand up with Ron O'Leary, our former housing court judge. Ron, you want to kick in a quick question? Or
Yeah,
comment?
thanks. Just about the eviction. I don't remember if you said expungement, but there are a number of courts in the state that have adopted local rules on sealing eviction records. Cleveland, I believe Cleveland Heights, Toledo Housing Court. So if there's any discussion at the state level, please let me know. Because that was kind of the thought was when we first put the eviction sealing rule in place in Cleveland, it was sort of the first step to get people to realize that the sky was not going to fall with something like that. But knowing that it would take probably some initial steps before getting the General Assembly to pass anything statewide. So I'd be happy to talk to anybody if you want.
Well, thanks, Ron, and thanks to all of our participants. And if anybody is on the call who's interested in being part of our conference planning committee, we meet monthly and try to devise other programs and plans and speakers. And your ideas are always important. And we're always looking for anybody who wants to help underwrite the cost of these forms. They're free and open to the public, and we offer CLEs. So if you're a lawyer and want to get some free CLEs, let us know if you're a speaker. And if not, we have a reasonable amount of money that we charge for CLEs. So thanks again. Thanks, Dennis. Thanks to the planning committee, and thanks to all of you who are making a difference in Ohio lives. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.